Today we're going to be talking to, talking to you lot out there. So I was just going to do a quick introduction, and my name's Alan Chamberlain. I'm going to let Dave introduce himself first.
Hi, yes, I'm David De Roure. I'm based at the University of Oxford, also at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK National Institute for Data Science and AI. And actually my research there is on AI and music. And I also work with PRISM, the Centre for Practice and Research in Science and Music at the Royal Northern College of Music.
So my name's Alan Chamberlain. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the Mixed Reality Lab, and I'm a Honorary Fellow in the Department of Music at University of Nottingham. And I've done some work with Dave in the past, worked on a project called FAST, and I've got a couple of other projects that are based around, one with Dave actually on sound art and the Internet of Things, funded by Petrus, and another project which is based around trying to start to unpack some of the issues around understanding AI and music. So today, I hope this is going to be of interest to everybody. Well, I know it is. There are a few things that we're going to be talking about. This is more of a conversation stroke lecture that we're going to be having. Dave's going to be sharing some slides. We'll put in some links to music and links to other interesting things that are happening, so people can go away and look at that. So we'll be talking about issues around computational creativity, the experimental digital humanities, the human in the loop, AI, I guess, compositional practice in a rather abstract way. Is there anything else, Dave, that I've missed? There are probably loads of things that I've missed that are going to pop up.
That certainly is where we're starting. It'll be exciting to see where we end up.
Yeah, these things often emerge as you discuss these things. But I think as a starting point, in an earlier discussion, we were chatting to Dave, and he was going to perhaps start with reflecting on some work that we'd done, or that he'd actually started, based around Ada Lovelace.
Sure. I'm going to share a picture of Ada Lovelace. There we are. Probably people have heard of Ada Lovelace, and she has a very important role today as an icon of women in computing. And she's held up as one of the first women programmers, one of the first people to write a program. And the computer in question was Charles Babbage's analytical engine, which remains a hypothetical engine. Here's an artist's impression from Sidney Padua. Fast steam-powered mechanical computing device, which interestingly has a lot about it, which is similar to the architectures of computers we use today. Now, we could discuss that role of Ada Lovelace, but I think the really significant thing I wanted to mention here is, while Babbage and others were thinking about crunching numbers, building log tables in order to help with engineering and so on, Lovelace was asking questions about what about computers creating music, and can computers be creative? So she was interdisciplinary. She was actually a musician. People forget this. So when she's held up as a STEM icon, she really should be a STEAM icon, like this picture. And some of the things she wrote, which were in the sort of footnotes to a translation she was doing of a talk by Babbage about the analytical engine, are very important quotes that people still use today. So those are those notes, and these are the things she wrote. This is the music one. Supposing, for instance, that the fundamental relations of pitch, sounds in the science of harmony and music composition were susceptible of such expression and adaptations, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. So this is an important early quote. You see it quite often. We can have long, interesting discussions about what elaborate and scientific pieces of music might be. But it's definitely about the computer in the process of creation of music. And then the other thing in her very extensive notes, which she observes, and things like, there are several quotes around this. This is just one of them. is when she said the analytical engine has no pretensions to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. It can follow analysis, but has no power of anticipating any analytical relations or truths. Its province is to assist us in making available what we're already acquainted with. That's one view. You can find some other statements about this, but this is much discussed, including by Turing, and in particular by Margaret Bowden, who created the Lovelace questions, which kind of tease apart various aspects of creativity in computers, as Alan said, of computational creativity. And by that, I'm referring to, I choose my words carefully, computers doing things that would require creativity in humans. But it's very much that world of, it's the world of the Turing test. It's that world of, can you tell the difference? Was this piece of music created by a human or by a machine? I'll just come out of the sharing there. So that's, back in the 1800s, that's 1843, those quotes, that discussion commenced. And back in 2015, we had a celebration of the 200th anniversary of the birth of Ada Lovelace at a 2-day symposium in Oxford. And I had the privilege of as being the organizer responsible for music. So we went back to Lovelace's quote. I discussed it with colleagues in the sort of digital computational musicology world. And everyone said, well, obviously what I should do is go away and use an emulator of the analytical engine and generate some music. So that's what I did. And we did it with the mathematics of the 19th century. And obviously lots of things that were going on in maths in the 19th century are still with us today. But lots of things we do today weren't around then. So we worked with some mathematicians to figure that out and created some music and then put that on the web as a tool that anyone could use. So it's called Numbers into Notes, numbersintonotes.net. And you can choose algorithms, you can generate music. There's a human in the loop aspect to this. I said generate music, generate fragments of music. Yeah. There's a human in the loop aspect to this, which is, it's a bit like an ink block test. What we would do is lay out, we do a mapping from the numbers coming out of a numerical sequence into notes. We play that to people, and then they choose the bits in that they wanted. We'd isolate those fragments, and then they could assemble those fragments. And then, Alan, you took this and you turned it into a social machine.
Yeah, well, there are a few bits to this, really. I mean, I kind of knew what you were doing, but I'm always a bit not suspicious, but lots of people talk about things like AI and computational creativity, and there's there's lots of stuff that's, I don't know, that makes you want to get hold of these tools so you can play with them and experiment with them to see what you can actually do. And I'd come across your stuff, Dave, and I was quite surprised when you said, when I said, well, is there a tool that I can use? And you went, yeah, it's online. So I was like, wow, this is like somebody who's actually doing stuff and creating it for normal people to use that are not advanced programmers or anything. And obviously I do understand programming, but what I wanted to do was, after reading those quotes that Dave put up, I was really interested in the way that you've got somebody like Ada Lovelace almost, I suppose, hypothesizing or I certainly mirrored ideas of contemporary technology onto that, such as sequencers and things that can automatically generate note sequences and sounds and all that kind of stuff. And I was really interested in looking at the mechanics of that machine and the noise that it might make, because that's what that quote kind of meant to me as well. Imagine that it's taking the music theory and composing stuff, but also the sounds that will come out of machines that might be able to use in a musical way. So I played around. I used that in quite a loose way with some of the software that Dave had written, and I had this idea about, could I get a series of people to send me sequences that they'd also made using this technology. So what I did, it was kind of like a crowdsourcing digital humanities experiment. And Dave always uses the term experimental digital humanities. And I interpret that as in the way that you get experimental archaeology, where you go and you use tools or you experiment with the way that people might have done stuff in order to understand what they were doing and how they did it. So I thought, wow, this is great. I can use some of Dave's software. I can get other people to use it. I can then see if I can then be that human in the loop, because I believe in some of the old Ada Lovelace writings, there was this person, the controller, or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I became the controller, the orchestrator, which is quite an apt term, really. Whereas I sent out to people and said, "Can you send me in interesting things that you've made on this? I'll put some of my own work in, and then I've got the job of pulling all those things together to compose something." And also I used some field recordings that I'd collecting. It's quite nice because in terms of bell ringing, there's also these patterns that people follow.
It's group theories, campanology. Yeah, absolutely.
You can get books and books of these patterns. It looks very, very similar to the old like Jacquard loom or punch card systems that used to control computers. So I thought, wow, this is great, and I'll do that, and I'll get somebody I'll do some recordings, and I'll pull it all together. And I think at the time, I know that Adrian's in the lecture now with you now. I think Adrian thought it was going to be a bit beepy, but we pulled it all together. And Dave and I were at Oxford House in Bethnal Green, and we did a little performance for about an hour. It was an interesting thing to do because what it look, there we are.
There we are.
Yeah, I think we were feeling good because we just had some food, and our setup time was much quicker than other people's. Yeah, so what we were able to do by doing this was we were starting to experiment more and more, I suppose, in a performative way. We were thinking about, I was using Ableton Live, and I'd got all these samples and sequences in place. I was navigating through them, pulling them together to try and create something that was going to be listenable and interesting to the audience, and trying to keep that within 8 minutes. And also there are all these, what I was trying to do is push it a bit. So I knew what the samples were, I knew what the sequences were, but I'd not put them together in any order. So for me, there was a little bit of that kind of, I don't know, it's good to be on edge a little bit, to get a bit of nervousness, because you're on the verge of doing something. And to be honest, it could have all collapsed and been absolutely dreadful, but it didn't. It worked really, really well. And I certainly know with that piece that I did, I think you showed it at the Turing Institute, not Turing Institute, at Tate Modern.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of got another airing at Tate, and then it's been used numerous times, hasn't it, as an example of what could be done and what could be made.
You mentioned experimental humanities, and there's an interesting aspect of that, because in a way I think that's what we were doing with the numbers into notes work, in the sense that we didn't exactly know what Ada Lovelace had meant by those quotes. We could study the period, we could study the literature, we can study Babbage's design and so on. And in a way, what we were doing was a creative response to that. But in humanities, there's this notion of close reading. So we could study those words in the footnotes in that book very, very closely, or we can build it.
Yeah.
And my claim would be we get insights into the process through the act of constructing it. And we have a phrase for this: digital close reading by digital prototyping. Could be in software, could be in hardware.
Yeah.
And that's a phrase that we've used in papers with our colleague Pip Wilcox, who's helping us with this work.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, one of the things that he did, I was sort of, as somebody who works in a research lab, I was also interested in how you could use this sort of work to start to think about issues of trust, and are the tools that you're producing, do they kind of form a platform for more instrumental works? How can I use it? How can I destroy it? How can I? But what was really good about this was it started to, I think Dave is probably the same opinion. It starts to kind of unpack the role that the human plays more in these sorts of systems. And it is kind of obvious in a way when you look at people playing with the synthesizers, and I know that there's a vogue at the moment for modular synths and that kind of stuff, but really they're the people who are sort of plugging and unplugging and altering frequencies and messing around with the sort of resonators and such like.
I think, yeah, absolutely. And so we've been working with the human in the loop. We've been assembling fragments, and that's one way of looking at music composition and performance and improvisation.
Yeah.
At the same time, those colleagues of ours who have been studying computational creativity have been doing a different thing, which is not about having the humans in the loop.
No.
It's about whether you can tell the difference as to whether this piece of music was created by a human or machine. Actually, I've got a picture of that. Here we are. So this was the Vortex Jazz Club in Dalston back in 2016, and a colleague of ours, Geraint Wiggins, had organised an event with his colleagues, which involved human performers performing a series of pieces of music where, for each composer, in quotes, they would do 2 human composed pieces and 1 computationally composed piece. And in the audience, we sat there with our pens and questionnaires, and we had to tick the box to say which we thought was human and which we thought was machine. It's really, really interesting exercise. And I think from a science viewpoint, probably we shouldn't have been looking at the performers, because you get clues from the expressions on their faces as to whether it's a familiar piece of music or not, and also whether the music was very consciously written to be performable. So probably by sitting in the front row, I had a few more signals to tell the difference. But it was very impressive, and lots of people got the wrong answers. I suppose that's there's a moral to that. Interestingly, the things that stick in my mind about that evening, there's this piece called Daddy's Car, which you can find on YouTube by Benoit Carré, working with Francois Pachet, who's a colleague of ours, amazing guitarist. And it's a good example of some pop generated with AI, and by training it on Beatles. Again, I was sitting in front of Benoit Carré when he was performing that, and watched him do some of those chord changes, but he did them very well. So we're beginning to get more human interpretation there of what the AI has done. And then there's our colleague Mark Dinverno from Goldsmiths, and Mark's view is the quote: "Even if you don't think machines can be creative by themselves, they can potentially be creative friends. You can imagine a situation when you're having a conversation with a machine offering prompts as a critical creative accomplice." And it's that human in the loop conversation. I would really emphasize the word co-creation, which is where most of my work has been. So there's quite 2 distinctive strands of work here. There's the can you tell whether it's human or machine, which a lot of AI researchers sort of go into that because they have a clear success criteria. And then there's this world that Mark's hinting at here, which is, human. What does it mean to be the creative human living with AI? And I think that's a really important question.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about that is I think we did write a very short paper a while ago, like this sort of angel on my shoulder kind of metaphor, where the artificial intelligence bit is an extension of yourself, really, but it's suggesting things that perhaps you could never imagine. So some of those things that it imagines, like Dave alluded to earlier, are like, for example, they might not work. So when you're playing, I mean, I play classical guitar a bit, but when you kind of look at some notation and it says play sort of 8 notes at once, well, you kind of can't do that on a 6-string instrument. So there's something that composers can add to the mix. They can kind of make things more human and more playable, and design for performance. On the other hand, sometimes some of the work that I've written, which we'll put links to up later or add them at the end of the video, it's not designed to be played by humans. It's designed to be played as a tape piece. So it's a performance piece. It's not necessarily performed by people live. The piece is designed to be played, but people that I know think it's orchestrated in a way because it sounds like an orchestrated piece. But that was the idea behind it. How do you work with tools that predominantly do lead you to sound like you're creating digital music when you don't want to create music that sounds digital. So how do you orchestrate using these sorts of systems that might give you, might lead you, or always give you a kind of electronic feel that's like kind of sterile, leapy. And I think that's like any tools that you use, really, isn't it? If you're using Max MSP, or you're programming in Java, or even if you play a violin or a banjo, or you're a singer, you're kind of confined. So being able to take something, whether that's noises or whether it's notes, pitches, the length of the pitch, sequences of notes, and feed them into something as data, push a button and have something feed back to you that you then navigate in order to reuse. And you're not necessarily going to use what the system outputs, but it might give you ideas in the way that we perhaps open a book, a music book, or I don't know, you get your bass out, Dave, and you play a few notes and I say, hey, hold on, let me get my guitar, let's kind of work something up. So
no, I completely agree. That just describes the co-creation very well. And I know you described this before as you're kind of navigating the latent space. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. A PhD student at the Royal Northern College of Music, Robert Laidlow, has created some contemporary classical pieces of music with AI, about AI. I think quite distinctive at that. One of the pieces, which we can share a link to, is where he trained the AI in his own work. Then he would prompt it and it would respond, and then he would respond back to that. So it absolutely was a conversation. One of the movements is a conversation. But this use of AI in this fashion now, where we're seeing some, lots of people like to train on Bach or Chopin and demonstrate they can produce music that's like Bach or Chopin. We've actually been doing music and AI for forever, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I was first involved in, I'm a Lisp programmer. I was involved in AI back in the 80s, and I have a quote. Let me share this. So I think we should all mention George Lewis more often. So if you read the text on the left here, he's describing a system called Voyager, non-hierarchical interactive musical environment that privileges improvisation. In Voyager, improvisers engage in dialogue with a computer-driven, interactive, virtually improvising orchestra. The computer program analyzes aspects of the human improviser's performance in real time, using that analysis to guide an automatic composition, or if you will, improvisation program that generates both complex responses to the musician's playing and independent behavior that arises from its own internal processes. So doesn't that describe the sort of thing we're talking about now and that we might be aiming to do tomorrow? But the point is, this software was written in the 80s. You can see a program on the right there, the performances of Voyager back in 86. So really, we have been working on this for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I think as well, it's interesting that he puts the system down, doesn't he, as the sort of computer performer.
Yeah.
So I think as well, I think now, I think I'm sure about this, that he can, yeah, so Voyager now runs as like a Max MSP patch.
Yep, that's right.
And he can play with his trombone in order to sort of kick it off, and that starts playing against him. He can plug it into sort of one of the, I don't know, I call it one of the Yamaha intelligent pianos. I can't remember what the name is, but I almost said pianola, but that would be from the past. Yeah. But yeah, it is. But yeah, people have been experimenting with pianolas in the past, haven't they? Which, I mean, the group can talk about afterwards. But yeah, in fact, George Lewis fascinates me because I think I mean, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but he seems to come from a tradition of improvisation.
Absolutely.
So when he starts playing, the system starts to play, not against him, I would say, but with him. And then he starts playing with that, and it triggers different things, or the stops, or and he carries on, or he stops and it performs. And he's a really, really interesting and very, very articulate person. He's kind of good to listen to because he very much crystallizes ideas more in terms of, I think, as an ethnographer in some ways. So I think the last thing that I saw, he was discussing 4 different ways of understanding improvisation. And he sort of this, I don't know, he talks about the choices that are made and an agency. I've got a few more things and that I think are important. But for his stuff, he's doing it in the moment.
Yeah.
With his system. It's very much, all this stuff's being done. He's an expert. He's there. He understands how to improvise. It becomes a performance and a composition. And he's kind of on the verge. He's on the edge, isn't he? He's there doing it at that very moment. Except there's like hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of programming gone into developing the system. I know. Sorry, I was going to say with my stuff, I'm very much based on Dave's ideas and probably George Lewis's as well. I've got a workflow where I write something, notate it. I stick it in Dorico, which I usually, you might use Finale or something else. I then import that into Ableton. I then use some AI tools. I use Google Magenta, and then I start to experiment with that. So I can make things sound like music that I've already written, but I can mess around with the probability and I can make it sound nothing like I've written. But then I can go back and choose little pieces out of the suggestions that are made by the machine based on my work, and a bit like Rob, feed it back in if I want to. But I know that I was listening to you, Dave, a talk with Emily Howard the other day, and I was fascinated with some of the stuff they were working on, the Royal Northern College of Music. And it's George's stuff is in the moment. My stuff takes a few minutes. It can take longer to record, but that stuff seemed to take hours and hours.
Yeah.
Would you like to?
Yeah, I can say something about that.
What exactly is Prism?
Prism is the Centre for Practice and Research in Science and Music. It was founded a few years ago now by Emily Howard, composer, Marcus de Sotoy, and myself. So Marcus is a mathematician from Oxford. Yeah. And then we had some funding from Research England. So we set up a lab. So one of the answers to what is Prism is that it's a lab. Yeah. We have many students of all sorts of different kinds involved with it at the Royal Northern, and also we have visiting artists and scientists and writers. And we're absolutely addressing this. And we have a research software engineer. So his name's Chris Meelan. You can hear him on a recent podcast. We'll provide a link to that. But he took a published algorithm, sample RNN. We created our own implementation of that, which was easily accessible to the community who wanted to use this. Going back to your point earlier, Alan, these things have to be accessible and usable. Now what sample RNN does is it's working at audio sample level rather than note level. I'll come back to notes, but so you train on audio, you have to chunk it up, train it. Some of those training sessions are running on, they're 2 rather warm machines in the lab. And we also use GPU clusters that are available, remotely. Those sessions can run for days or weeks. And we've got quite good at understanding how to do that and understanding how to tune the algorithms in order to get some interesting things back. And it's those interesting things back that then prompt the composers perhaps to use them, or perhaps to notate something that is inspired by what the AI has done. And online you can find some sort of sample RNN outputs based on training on Beethoven, for example. They're quite provocative, creative inputs. Lots of training is involved. Now the other world in Prism is working at note level. And largely, this is what Robert Laidlaw did early on. This is what we were all doing earlier on. And it's a bit like using AI for text. I mean, whether it's a text or whether it's a MIDI, whether it's a word or a MIDI event, essentially these things are getting mapped down to numbers in a neural network. And we were then 2 or 3 years ago using approaches like LSTM in order to train the neural network and then prompt it, and it would generate some more output. And that's the sort of cycle that Rob was in when he was doing his early composition work. there's a piece called Alter, which was performed at the Barbican in 2019. Actually, let me show you a picture of that.
So basically, with the sample-based system, what you're doing is taking chopped up audio, feeding it into the AI, and then that feeds back a series of combinations of that audio that you can then listen to and you can navigate through. At note level, it's feeding you back. You're feeding it a series of notes and sequences and pitches, and it's analyzing each one of those and the sequences, and then feeding it back, I suppose, almost as some sort of score.
Yeah, exactly. So here are Alter being performed at the Barbican. We've got the written Sinfonia. The objects on the left is the Lovelace engine, which is inspired by the Babbage analytical engine. That's another talk. This is interesting at many levels, and it's composed with AI, about AI. At one point, the mezzo soprano sings a duet with herself, where the self she's singing with has been processed by AI. But I wanted to mention the text as well, because at this stage, the approach we were using, 2019, to the music generation was really at note level. And we use very similar approaches to generating the text, generating the libretto that was being sung in this. I'll just show you this picture of how that was done. There's quite a lot of sort of AI points to make here. So again, back to where we started, Lovelace and Babbage. So we took the correspondence between Lovelace and Babbage that's on deposit in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Many biographers have transcribed parts of this, including our colleague Ursula Martin. And we use that to train an AI, like a ghost Ada Lovelace. You could prompt it with a line, and it would, ghost Ada Lovelace would respond with another line, and so on. But the trouble is, when you use the standard AI models that are available online, they've learned their language model from, for example, Reddit or Wikipedia or everything they can possibly find, which is not the language of Ada Lovelace. So we built a 19th century language model based on correspondence, because we're using letters, also held in the Bodleian Library in a collection called Electronic Enlightenment. They very kindly shared their data to us for training. And so we had, in some senses, more realistic, I don't know what we mean by that word, Ada Lovelace. And we did some time travel, and we did use some 21st century AI as well. There's a whole lot of interesting things in here. This is working with text. The same issues arise with music, because once you've taken some content and trained on it, and you have a thing, what are the rights of use of that thing? Where's the intellectual property? What's the copyright situation, and so on? And this diagram you see here has been examined by copyright experts, and everything seems to be fine. But it is an interesting question as to who owns what and when in a workflow like this.
But it's also, I don't know. I mean, it does make you think of what I've tried to do in the past is that for me, it doesn't really matter whether it's note level or audio sampling that you're doing. It's that you get something come back and you can mold it or explore it. Or the beauty about getting MIDI back is that you can add your own sound to it, and that you can make things sound based on if you want a cello to play it or somebody to sing it, or you want heavily distorted guitars, or you can create your own ambience based around that note level structure. I think it's quite difficult when you get a sample back and then you think it's a sample which has been played, and you almost get less control over it in some way. So for me, I like to have that constant. I like to have control over things. It's that's just the way it is. It is I like to spend a long time doing things, whereas I can imagine. I suppose on another project that I'm working on, the trustworthy autonomous systems, I was discussing with somebody about, for example, robots that could listen to the ambient sound or could listen to performances, and then the intelligence system could feed you back chunks of that, and then you use those chunks to perform with in the moment. So there are all kinds of interesting things that you can do there. But then again, it does feel, I don't know how you feel about this, but it does feel again like some sort of improvisation, and that I know that I'd use the word affordance as a musical instrument. It's like with the guitar, which have got frets and strings on it, and you have to place your hands in certain places, and certainly trombones, where you know there's certain lengths that you use to kind of create various notes, or harps, or each one of those is restricted somehow, but also offers opportunities. With these sorts of systems, I don't know what you think, Dave. We don't really know what the opportunities are yet.
No, I completely agree, and it's really good to talk about affordances and ask ourselves questions about the affordances of these systems that we're creating. And as you say, a creative response to being given an instrument with some affordances is to use those, but also to try to break them and explore the edges. And these are hugely important discussions. And it really, this is probably what music has to say to people who are doing AI research, because I am worried that people are sitting at workstations and testing their excellent algorithms with their excellent statistical methods and demonstrating that this is nearly as good as a human or better, and not thinking about the thing we mentioned earlier, living in the moment with the AI. So I think robots are a really good example, but AI pervasively deployed in our buildings, our homes, our vehicles, our bodies. That discussion needs to be occurring. AI researchers need to be thinking about the affordances of the AI and the interaction. There's a provocative phrase, which is AI is too important to be left with computer scientists. So I hope the computer scientists respond to that provocation by demonstrating that some really good HCI can help us a lot here.
Well, I don't know. I completely agree with that. I mean, I had a chat with Doug Eck and Ben Laurie from Google Research.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things that Doug said, I can't remember who he was talking about. I think it was a band called Yacht, who used a lot of artificial intelligence in their work. And it was like they'd created the album cover, I think lyrics, I think the music. I don't know whether they'd done some. So there are different sorts of AI where perhaps you could merge sound together. So you might have the sound of a bee, a very expensive Hauser acoustic guitar, and a sort of Steinway piano, and you can merge them together to create new sounds. But I think the band's, what would you call it? I don't know. Aesthetic was not to alter anything that the AI had offered. So they'd obviously had to edit stuff. But I thought, yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about, because how do you, I suppose nowadays you think, how do you notate for performances like the ones that we're kind of alluding to, where we don't really know what's going to be performed, and we've got some idea and we're trying to control it, and it's hard to know, because it's kind of, some of it's the stuff's in the moment, and you know that people have to attune to using those tools, which are amazingly important for improvisers. And at the same time, you're getting technologists that are composers that understand about music, such as us, where we're thinking, hold on, this interesting space that people are playing in, where they can improvise and use these tools. Well, actually, I think George Lewis says a similar thing. It does inform other areas. So improvisation is not just something that relates to music. It's also something that relates to like healthcare, or relates to writing, or getting out of a scrape, or repairing your car. So is there anything that arguably you might learn from using these sorts of tools in a musical context that we can then apply to other domains?
Yes, I think it really is a two-way street. We're adopting some technologies, but equally we have a lot to say about the use of those technologies. That sounds like there's just two things happening in opposite directions, but there's something else going on here. We're constructing something new.
Yeah.
I suppose you could argue this at any point in history, that somehow the technology has affected the sort of the genre of new music that's occurring. But what we've just been discussing is a genre of music involving AI. And various little quirky aspects of that are already kicking in, and people are using them, even in human composed compositions, because there's a new thing appearing there.
One of the things about this that I find fascinating is that I don't know, I mean, perhaps people in the in the audience know more about this than I do. But one thing that scares the hell out of me is free improvisation. And recently, when I've been messing around with some of the AI tools, it's what I've been doing is experimenting and doing some free improvisation, and then feeding that into the system to then work with that. And I've got this approach where you've got some stuff which is in the moment, and then you've got some stuff which is heavily worked upon, and you bring these two things together and you sort of almost layer. So you've got layered improvisation where you're bringing in the moment stuff with very, very controlled composed stuff as well. So I don't know where this is leading me, but I think sometimes it's nice to work in an area that kind of scares you a little bit.
I think it's a really, really good point. And in a way, what we're doing with AI is embracing the disruption. And that's leading to new creativity. Here's that George Lewis quote. So first of all, this one addresses some of the things we've mentioned. We've been talking about, is it human, is it machine, is it co-created? And he's recently made the point, thus it's come to pass not only that improvisations by creative musical machines are often indistinguishable from those by humans, but also they need not be so distinguished. And I think this is very helpful for me, because I think I've come to that conclusion slowly, that we make all this fuss about which is which. We've discussed the different ways of doing it, as we've been talking about it. But actually, as we were just saying, in the end, you've created this new thing, this new genre, if you like, this new content, and it's indistinguishable, but you don't worry about it. And then you're in the moment point. Again, Lewis points for interesting improvisation technologies. So the Mars rover, the problem of the self-driving vehicle. Driving is basically a kind of improvising.
Yeah.
He's always felt that much could be learned from the efforts to get computers to improvise music. So it's that point. How do we take this discussion back to all our colleagues in AI and computer science and technology and say, look, actually, we know how to tackle some of these things that are really important. These are the problems you're about to have. We know some of the answers.
I think it also lets you look at, perhaps we're going a little bit off music here into another dimension, but Dave used the term latent space earlier. And the way that I understand that or use that term is once you get something like a series of notes and you chuck it into the AI and it throws something back out of you, you can navigate it. And you can either tell the system how to cluster it, or it automatically clusters it. With music, this is quite a complex, or audio, complex space, because you've not only got pitches, timbres, multiple timbres, the system trying to identify what instruments are, who's played them, the genre, the context, the time. So you've got a space there where you can have hundreds of dimensions, but the way that we understand the world is possibly 2 to 3 dimensions, but then you've got this temporal dimension, and so navigating that latent space, certainly trying to understand issues around that, which is possibly sounds quite a complex thing at the moment, but it's not. Is something that I think particularly people in the room are going to come across in the next 10 years. How do we visualize the output of humongous amounts of data when all we're after is some kind of, I don't know, the vibe that a good producer might get through saying, you know what, turn the reverb up, move that microphone over there. You're not after perfection, are you? You're after interest. And I think a lot of times the good thing about music is you can experiment. So I think perhaps a not so good thing about AI and the way it's being applied is that it's trying to deal with efficiency and perfection. So it's almost stripping away what we as humans can do to create and explore. And I just hope that's something that I'm working in the computer science department, obviously, but I just hope it's something that people don't try and create a looky-likey or sound alike or some kind of glorified puppetry.
And I think acknowledging that that's what we're using the AI for. It's there for disruption. It's there for getting us to think about things we wouldn't have thought about otherwise. And going back to your original point about usable tools, we actually need some AI tools in music that are disruptive like that and are experimental and come into that experimental process and let you navigate that latent space and map it in different ways.
Yeah.
I started my career in hypertext, and in a way, we're in this amazing musical hypertext of the latent space. It's very exciting. We need to be building the tools for that. I mean, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, and this is also being discussed in Prism at the moment, is working more with musical structure. The giveaway with the AI generated music with many systems is if you let it run on a bit, it sort of forgets where it's been because it hasn't got the big picture of the structure. But that's addressable. It's the long range dependency problem. But we can learn structures. We can do things with that. So I want tools that let me do that.
I suppose the thing, isn't it, when you think about this, is machines don't have memories in the way that we do. They're not copies. I know you can argue with that they have memory, but they don't have memories. They're not.
Yeah.
And adding context to that kind of stuff is quite important, particularly for people who are working in composition, because sometimes you want something to sound in a certain way because you know it will affect people in a certain way. And sometimes you don't want to put too much emphasis on it because you want people to have their own opinions of it. And I certainly know with my work, I've been quite surprised when people have, even when it's been tape pieces, people come up to you and say, that was quite scary at the end. What did you do? It's like, what, I mean, that mellow bit. So I don't know. It would be great there, wouldn't it, if you could sort of annotate your work. I mean, a couple of other things that I think that's worth mentioning before we perhaps gently come to a close is that, I mean, Dave and I have been talking about sort of notes and sounds and AI in regard to that, but there's no reason that you can't get some, I guess, some research-based software, such as I think there's Wekinator, where it will you can use gesture to control sound or sequences or that sort of stuff. And it might be also worth looking at the Carolan guitar.
Definitely.
Yeah, Steve Benford's I suppose concepts that links up the Internet of Things and also the non-intelligent Internet of Things in a way. So he's got Adrian could talk more about that. But you can scan in codes on that and it can play stuff or trigger things. And excitingly, I mean, I'm chatting to Steve at the moment about some kind of Carolan guitar on the road work. So he might be taking it out and we might be using one of the I don't know what is it, sort of AI and folk databases where it generates music based around Turlo O'Carolan's work, and then he can perform with that as well.
Yeah,
so
that's very exciting.
There's all kinds of but we'll stick a link up to Wekinator and stuff like that. And
in terms of tools that are out there, there's a fantastically vibrant community, which is music information retrieval. And they produce many tools. They have an annual event called Mirex where the tools are evaluated. So it's a really rich area. And that sounds like it's analysis. And analysis might sound like dull and we're talking about composition, but actually, now we're working as digitally as this. Now we're working with AI. How those MIR tools come into our compositional process is really interesting.
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, oddly enough, I was following that conference. It's
Izmir.
Izmir. So it's worth looking at and worth looking at those papers, particularly if you've got to write an essay or something, because it's not. I think originally I felt as though it was a bit drier than it was, but it's not. It's really, really interesting. There are people building all sorts of tools and looking at musical structure and how it can be used or how you might want to interpret or change. There's also NIME that
absolutely.
If you're interested in sort of instruments and musical expression and all kinds of weird, wonderful, and exciting tools and instruments there that are being designed. And we had, in fact, hosted, possibly in the room where you're watching this talk, is the Audio Mostly conference, which happens every year as well. But certainly, I mean, do go out and have a look at these conferences and the community, because it's worth going along if they're ever local. just to see what people are building and the ideas they've got. It's I suppose it's particularly exciting in a way because we don't know. I mean, we're talking about composing, performing, and creativity, but the other way to think about this is that how will we listen to this kind of work in the future? Will it be nowadays when you listen to something, there's one version often of a track, or it's a version of a track, which you kind of, it's like Dave De Roure playing, you know, or Hollywood Bowl, or you know, Oxford, wherever, or but it might be like this is version 1211 of or so. And there's some interesting work there, which is also being there's a project called Future Mundane, which I think is as a collaboration between Lancaster and Nottingham, and they've got a caravan with all these really interesting kind of technologies that can be adapted to show you how you might engage in these sorts of things in the future. So do keep your eye out and look out for these things, because it will inevitably give you, I suppose, something that that might spark some kind of I don't know, ideas of something that you might compose for. So I don't know there's much else to say there, you know. I think we've done quite a lot.
Yep. Thank you, Alan.
So no problem. So I think there's going to be a bit of a panel or some questions afterwards. So so there you go. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you, Alan.